Welcome to Part 2 of the Whitman Ball Murder. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 5. I had gone upstairs to grab my coat, my uncle insisting I step away from a scene that seemed to compromise my reputation. Once ready to leave, I was crossing the hall toward the small door that led to the side staircase, where my uncle promised to meet me, when I was suddenly struck by the urge to take one last look below before departing from a place filled with my deepest memories. A broad landing, breaking up the main staircase a short distance from the top, offered an excellent vantage point. Without much thought for the possible consequences or my patient uncle waiting for me, I slipped down to this landing. Shielded by the height of its balustrade, I allowed myself a final glance at the scene that would forever be linked to my most intense feelings. Before me stretched the large square of the central hall, leading to the corridor that connected to the front door and, incidentally, to the library. As I peered down the corridor, I spotted the tall figure of the Englishman emerging from the room I had just left. He paused as he reached the main hall, gazing intently at a group of men and women gathered near the fireplace. The moment my eyes fell on them, I found myself just as captivated. The inspector had come from the room with Mr. Monroe, and was displaying an extraordinary diamond he had recently recovered under some rather remarkable, if not dubious, circumstances. Heads of all ages leaned in to examine it, and I strained to catch bits of conversation rising above the general noise, when I noticed Mr. Hopper make a sudden move. I turned my attention back to him just in time to see the worry on his face and the hesitation he displayed about whether to move closer or step back. Unaware of my watchful gaze, and noticing that most of the people in front of him had their backs turned, he showed no attempt to mask his intense fascination with the stone. His eyes followed its movement from one hand to another with a greedy eagerness that he might not even have realized. I was not at all surprised when, after a moment of troubled hesitation, he abruptly stepped forward and requested the chance to hold the gem himself. Our host, standing not far from the inspector, exchanged a few words with him, and soon the request was granted. The stone was handed over to Mr. Hopper, and I could see, perhaps because my heart was in my throat, that his hand quivered as it made contact with the jewel. In fact, his entire body shook, and I was anxiously watching for the outcome of his examination when he turned the diamond to catch the light. Then something extraordinary and deeply unsettling happened, something no one present in the house that moment would ever forget. A cry erupted from an unknown source, its piercing shrillness and haunting quality echoing through the rooms, fading into a wail so eerie, so captivating, and so drawn out that it seized not just my frail heart, but also the hearts of the 10 sturdy men gathered below. The diamond fell from Mr. Hopper's grasp, and neither he nor anyone else made a move to retrieve it. It was not until silence returned, a silence almost unbearable to the sensitive ear, as oppressive as the cry that had preceded it, that anyone moved or even thought of the gem. One gentleman after another leaned down to search for the stone, but none found it until one of the waiters, perhaps having tracked it with his eyes or caught a glimpse of its sparkle on the edge of the rug where it had rolled, sprang forward to retrieve it and handed it back to Mr. Hopper. The Englishman instinctively closed his hand around it, but it was clear to me, and I believe to everyone else, that his interest had faded. Even as he looked at it, he seemed distant, standing as though stunned, while the flurry of anxious men and women ran about in frantic attempts to locate the source of the sound still echoing in their ears. It was not until these frantic searchers all gathered again, gripped by a terror they could not understand, that he let the stone slip from his grasp and finally became aware of his surroundings. What he said next was as striking as everything that had happened. "Gentlemen," he began, "please forgive my distress. You need not pursue the origin of that cry. It is one I know all too well. I have been fortunate enough to father 6 children. 5 of them I have laid to rest, and before the passing of each, this same cry has haunted my ears. I have only one child remaining, a daughter. She is ill at the hotel. Can you blame me for recoiling from this chilling reminder, for revealing a weakness in the face of its impact? I am returning home. However, allow me to say a word about this stone. He lifted it, appearing to examine it with grave concern, adjusting his glasses to scrutinize it carefully before handing it back to the inspector. I have heard, he continued, with a tone shift that must have caught everyone's attention, that this stone is of exceptional quality and quite worthy of the reputation it enjoys here in America. But gentlemen, you have all been gravely misled about it. No one more so than the man who would go so far as to commit murder for its possession. The stone you just let me examine is not a diamond. It's a carefully crafted piece of paste, hardly worth the extravagant setting it's been placed in. I regret having to say this, but I've dedicated myself to the study of precious stones, and I can't allow this blatant imitation to go unchallenged. Mr. Whitman, I directed my words to our host, I must ask to express my apologies and take my leave immediately. My daughter's condition has worsened. I know it as surely as I stand here. The sound you just heard is the one superstition that haunts our family. God help me, I hope she is still alive. After that, what could anyone say? No one present, not even I with my romantic notions, believed his interpretation of the strange sound that had just echoed through the house. However, given his firm acceptance of it, as a warning and the failure of all attempts to identify its source, the only choice left was to allow this esteemed man to leave with the urgency his fears demanded. It was clear that this was against the inspector's wishes. Naturally, he would have preferred Mr. Hopper to stay, if only to clarify his astonishing conclusions about a diamond that had already passed through the scrutiny of some of the most respected judges in the country. With Mr. Hopper's departure, the inspector's demeanor shifted. He looked at the stone in his hand and slowly shook his head. I doubt Mr. Hopper's judgment can be trusted at this moment, he said, pocketing the gem as carefully as if his faith in its true value had not been significantly shaken by this distinguished foreigner's claims. I don't clearly remember how I finally left the house or what my uncle and I discussed on our way home. I was in shock, completely numb, with neither my mind nor feelings fully engaged. The only clear memory I have is the impression my childhood home left on me upon our arrival, feeling new and unfamiliar. So much had shifted, and I had changed so much in those 5 hours since I'd left. But nothing else stands out in my memory until that dreary morning when I awoke with a start to find my uncle's worried face leaning over me from the foot of the bed. Suddenly I found my voice, and a flood of questions poured out. He didn't answer. He couldn't. But when my anxiety escalated, he took the morning newspaper from behind him and placed it gently within my reach. Instantly, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. After sharing a few warm words, he left me alone, and I eagerly grabbed the paper to read the same headlines that countless others were reading across the city at that very moment. I will refrain from recounting what I already knew from the night before, but a few new details may intrigue you. The weapon discovered at the location stated by Mr. Monroe was of particular interest to those with an appreciation for curiosities. It was a stiletto, exquisitely crafted, long, sharp, and slender. Not an American creation, nor even from this century, it was a relic from the days when deadly blows were delivered in the shadowy corners of medieval streets. This was the first mystery. The second was the unexplained presence of 2 broken coffee cups on the alcove floor, which no waiter or anyone else claimed to have brought there. The tray that had slipped from Peter Mooney's hands, the waiter who first raised the alarm of murder, had contained only ices, not cups. This was a verified fact. However, 2 cup handles had been discovered among the wreckage, cups that must have been full, judging by the coffee stain left on the rug where they had fallen. As I read this, I recalled Mr. Monroe mentioning that he had stepped on some broken china while fleeing the tragic scene. This detail resonated with a theory that was slowly forming in my mind, so I moved on to the next paragraph, filled with anticipation. What I found was surprising. While others may have been informed, I was not aware that Mrs. Sinclair had received a message from outside, just moments before her death. A Mr. Fullerton, who had been to the alcove before Mr. Monroe, admitted that he had opened the window for her at some signal from outside, and had accepted a small note which was being lifted up on the end of a whip handle. He could not see who held the whip, but at Mrs. Sinclair's request, he removed the note from its pin and handed it to her. As she struggled to decipher it, it seemed barely legible. He glanced outside again and saw a figure darting from below toward the carriage drive. He did not recognize the person and doubted he would ever identify them again. Regarding the note itself, he could say little, only that Mrs. Sinclair appeared troubled by its contents. She had frowned and looked rather somber when he left the alcove. When asked if he had drawn the curtains closed after shutting the window, he replied that he had not, as she had not instructed him to do so. This odd account was further supported by the testimony of the coachman, who had lent his whip for the task. The coachman, known for his friendly disposition, had no qualms about lending his whip to a poor fellow who needed to send a telegram or some urgent message to the lady sitting above them in a lit window. The wind howled fiercely, and the snow fell thickly, so it was understandable that the man ducked his head. He was well aware of his appearance. He was either very cold or completely worn out, dressed in a greatcoat with the collar pulled up around his ears. When he returned with the whip, he seemed in better spirits than when he asked for it, but he offered no thanks for the kindness. If he did express gratitude, his voice was lost to the wind and the biting cold. The coroner had found a note in her hand that the police considered extremely significant. It was a hasty scrawl in pencil on a small scrap of paper. A facsimile of the note was shared with the public, hoping someone would recognize the handwriting. The first two lines were jumbled and hard to decipher, but the last line stood out clearly. Expect trouble if what? Hundreds were pondering that question at that very moment. I would soon find myself asking it too, but first I needed to grasp the situation, which until now seemed to implicate Mr. Monroe as the sole suspect. While I expected this, it hit me hard in the sharp light of the winter morning. It seemed unimaginable that anyone could associate guilt with a man of such impeccable character and esteemed reputation. Yet the evidence presented against him was compelling, evidence we all recognized. Even after reading the full account, I couldn't deny that its apparent weight affected me as well. My faith in his innocence remained unshaken. I had seen the love and gratitude in his eyes, and my confidence in him was restored. Yet, with the clarity that comes from careful study, I recognized how hard it would be to combat the prejudice he had faced. First, due to his own rash actions, notably that unfortunate attempt to hide Mrs. Sinclair's gloves in another woman's bag, and secondly, because of his unusual explanations, which to many must have sounded forced and unnatural. I felt an overwhelming resolve, knowing I was up against a monumental challenge. I believed in his innocence, and if others failed to prove it, I would take it upon myself to clear his name. I little Rita, without any experience in law, courts, or crime, but equipped with unwavering faith in the man who was accused and a keen insight of my own, an insight that had already proven invaluable and would serve me even better once I understood the details necessary for any intelligent action. The morning's report concluded with Mr. Monroe's explanations regarding the evidence against him. As a result, there was no mention of the events that had made such an impact on those present. Mr. Harper was referred to only as one of the guests, and any reader of that morning's issue would have no reason to doubt the authenticity of the diamond, which appeared to be the central motive behind the crime. The effect of this omission on my mind was strange. I began to wonder if the entire incident had been a figment of my troubled mind, a nightmare that had visited only me, rather than a reality to contend with. However, after a moment's thought, I shook off those doubts and realized that the police were simply being prudent in withholding Mr. Harper's sensational opinion on the stone until it could be verified by experts. The two gossip columns about the family rifts that led to the separation of Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair can be summarized in a few lines. They had been married 3 years earlier in Baltimore. At that time, he was wealthy, though not quite the multimillionaire he is today. With unremarkable features and a lack of social grace, he was ill-suited for the charming socialite she had become, whose allure only grew with time. Although no legitimate scandal ever marred her reputation, he became weary of her whims and the relationships that she made no effort to conceal, either from him or from society. At some point in the previous year, they had reached a friendly agreement to live separately, each maintaining a lavish lifestyle while still respecting the social norms that kept them in good standing among their friends. He rarely attended events where she would be present, and she never showed up where he was expected. Despite this, there was little bitterness between them. Their lives moved on quietly. To their credit, no one had ever heard either one speak poorly of the other. Currently, he was out of town, having left 3 weeks earlier for the Southwest, but would likely return upon receiving the telegram that had been sent to him. The talk surrounding the murder was quick and chaotic. It was labeled a mystery, but it was clear that Mr. Monroe's detention was seen as a nearly certain precursor to his arrest for murder. I had experienced some tough times myself. Though I was favored by my wealthy uncle, I had chosen early on to give up the prospects he offered of continued financial support, instead taking on responsibilities that demanded self-discipline and hard work. I chose this path because I found satisfaction in keeping both my mind and heart engaged. Being needed by someone, much like a nurse cares for a patient, seemed to me an admirable role until I met Anson Monroe. Then the longing of all women for the shared experiences of their gender became my longing, too, a longing I initially resisted, as it felt solitary, and therefore a sign of weakness. I fought my battle, and believed I had triumphed just as the nurse's diploma was handed to me. Then came the greatest shock of my life. Anson Monroe declared his love for me, and I realized that all my preparations had been aimed at the joys of home and the true essence of being a woman. I experienced an hour of bliss under this new light, followed by tragedy and a sense of impending chaos. I had truly undergone a profound education, but would it equip me to be useful in the only way I could be useful now? I didn't know, and honestly I didn't care. I was determined to pursue my path, whether I was ready or not. With renewed energy from this realization, I rose, dressed, and set about my tasks for the day. One of those tasks was to find out if Mr. Harper, upon returning to his hotel, had discovered that his daughter was as ill as he feared. A few telephone messages put my mind at ease on this front. Miss Harper was indeed very ill, but not in a critical state. In fact, her condition seemed to be improving, and if no new complications arose, she would likely be back on her feet in about 2 weeks. I was not surprised. It was more than I had hoped for. The eerie wail of the banshee in an American household felt unbelievable, even in an environment thick with fear and the terror that surrounded a great crime. As I mentally tallied my suspicions against a person whose name I will not mention at this moment, I noted this as yet another troubling detail. Chapter 6. To recount the full experiences of the next few days would only weigh down my narrative with unnecessary details. I did not see Mr. Monroe again. My uncle, usually agreeable in most matters, was unyielding on this issue. Until Mr. Monroe's reputation could be restored by the coroner's verdict, or until evidence arose that would fully clear him of suspicion, I was not to have any communication with him at all. I can still recall the exact words with which my uncle concluded our lengthy conversation on the matter. You have already expressed your confidence in Mr. Monroe's innocence. That will have to suffice for now. If he truly is the honest gentleman you believe him to be, then it should. Since my uncle rarely took a firm stand, and when he did, he was genuinely serious, I made no attempt to challenge his decision, especially as it aligned with my own better judgment. However, although my ability to extend sympathy was thus constrained, my thoughts and feelings were still free, and they were entirely devoted to the man grappling with an accusation that brought him shame and humiliation, which he was ill-equipped to handle given his previously comfortable life of social and financial stability. Despite the few facts that occasionally emerged to support his account, Mr. Monroe continued to be regarded as a suspect by nearly everyone. This struck me as profoundly unfair. What if there were no other leads, no other evidence acknowledged as such by either the police or the public? Shouldn't he at least benefit from anything that cast doubt on his guilt? For instance, the splash of blood I had seen on his shirt front and the distinct shape of it. Why did its being a splash rather than a spatter? Not to mention that it would have spattered if it had come from below, as he claimed. merit less consideration from those tasked with investigating this terrible crime. To me, it told a story of innocence that made me question how someone like the inspector could overlook it. But later, I understood. A single word opened my eyes. True, the stain was in the shape of a splash rather than a spurt, but a splash could easily have happened from a drop falling from the end of the stiletto, regardless of whether it fell early or late. And what evidence suggested that this drop hadn't fallen at the moment the stiletto was thrust into the lantern, instead of after the criminal had fled, and another man had entered? But the mystery of the shattered coffee cups. No explanation seemed available for that. And then there was the still unanswered question of the written warning found in the murdered woman's hand, a warning that had been deciphered to say, "Be warned, he intends to be at the ball." Expect trouble if, should this be interpreted as a warning directed at a man who, given the nature of his scheme, would keep his plans to himself. As for the stiletto, a photographic image of which appeared in every newspaper, was that the type of weapon a typical New York gentleman would choose for such a crime. It was a distinctive item, unique enough that one would assume it could easily be traced back to its owner. If Mr. Whitman had claimed it, recognizing it as one of the many pieces of art displayed in the lavish alcove, its use in the murder would only suggest the crime was potentially not premeditated, and thus wouldn't help in arguing for Mr. Monroe's innocence. But Mr. Whitman had denied any knowledge of it from the start, leading me to wonder if a man of Mr. Monroe's discernment would actually consider such an unusual weapon, when planning a shocking crime that was bound to attract the attention of the entire civilized world. Another argument, put forth by him and supported by his friends, was this: a jeweler dealing in precious stones would be the last person to pursue a jewel of such prominence through illegal means. He would understand better than anyone the impossibility of selling such a gem in any market outside the Orient. The counter-argument was that no one thought he would be so foolish. If he had intended to acquire that incredible diamond, it was likely to eliminate it from competition with the one he had secured for Mr. Smythe. This reasoning brought us back to our only defense, his previously spotless reputation, and the trust that those who knew him placed in him. However, what affected me most at that moment, and undoubtedly confused everyone, official or otherwise, was the unexpected validation by experts of Mr. Harper's view about the diamond. Although his name was not mentioned, and had been intentionally omitted from news reports, the hint he dropped to the inspector at Mr. Whitman's ball had been acted upon. Once the appropriate tests were conducted, the stone, for which many believed a life had been endangered and another lost, was confirmed to be an imitation, masterfully crafted and flawless, but still a counterfeit of the great and famous gem that had passed through Tiffany's hands a year earlier. This revelation struck those who had seen the diamond dazzling on the unfortunate Mrs. Sinclair's chest only an hour or two before her death like a thunderclap. As for me, the news left me in a daze for days, but that state didn't stop me from starting a small investigation of my own, which I will discuss later. I should mention that I did not share the widespread confusion on this matter. I had my own theory about why this switch had happened, and when it occurred, but the time hadn't come for me to share it yet. I could only hang back and listen to the speculation coming from the press, which stirred up so much private conversation that soon the most common question being asked wasn't about who dealt the fatal blow to Mrs. Sinclair. Many seemed to think that was settled, but rather who had pulled off the trick of swapping the real diamond for a fake, and how and when that had happened. Opinions on this matter were diverse, as I mentioned. Some pointed to the exact moment of the exchange, which they believed was crucial and barely noticeable, occurring between the murder and Mr. Monroe's arrival on the scene. This theory, I should note, was put forward by those who thought that, although he didn't murder Mrs. Sinclair, he had taken advantage of the chaos to steal what he presumed was her magnificent gem. Others, including several eyewitnesses, were convinced that the switch had occurred before the ball and with Mrs. Sinclair's full knowledge. The way she wielded her fan between the sparkling jewel on her dress and the prying eyes that followed it may have seemed like mere flirtation, but to them it appeared far more like a gesture of anxiety that her deception might be uncovered. No one pinpointed the moment like I did. Then again, no one else had observed the scene through the lens of love. Moreover, it must be noted that most people, including the police officers, were more focused on proving Mr. Monroe's guilt. Monroe was guilty, while I, with a different perspective, was determined to gather facts that would support the explanations he had graciously given us. These explanations led Mrs. Sinclair to believe strongly in the value of the jewel she wore and the need to temporarily part with it, especially if, as many suspected, the full warning read, "Be warned, he plans to be at the ball. Expect trouble if you wear the great diamond." It was possible she had been misled about the jewel. Unbeknownst to her, she might have fallen prey to a bold deception by someone close to her who had access to her jewelry. However, since there was no evidence to support this theory, and no recognized, or, so far as we could tell, secret lover or disloyal servant had been identified. Furthermore, no gem of such extraordinary worth had been reported offered in the past year, either here or abroad, in any public or private sale. I struggled to accept this notion. Perhaps it was because I had become fixated on another possibility, one that had taken root in my mind, one so bold that it bolstered my spirits through the long days of anxious waiting. I was resolved not to impose my theories, no matter how valuable I considered them, until all hope had faded of his being vindicated by those whose opinions mattered far more than that of a mere speck in the vast workings of justice like myself. The inquest, which was likely to clarify all these uncertain matters, had been postponed in anticipation of Mr. Sinclair's return. His testimony would undoubtedly prove crucial, if not for pinpointing the criminal, at least for determining whether the stone that the estranged wife had taken with her upon leaving was the genuine one returned to him from Tiffany's, or the notorious imitation currently held by the police. He had been somewhere in the lower Colorado mountains, but strangely enough, it had proven impossible to reach him directly. No one knew if he was even aware of his wife's tragic death. So, things moved slowly in New York, and the case seemed to stall when suddenly public interest reignited, and the whole situation took a more defined turn thanks to a dispatch from Santa Fe to the Associated Press. This dispatch reported that Abner Sinclair had passed through the city about 3 days prior, heading to his new mining camp, the Placide. It noted that he exhibited signs of pneumonia, and according to later information, was very ill. Ill, that explained everything. His silence, which many had misinterpreted as indifference, was simply that of a man physically unable to act. Ill, it was a heartbreaking circumstance that sparked endless speculation. Did he know, or did he not know, about his wife's death? Had he fallen ill before or after leaving Colorado for New Mexico? Was he suffering mostly from shock, or was it the result of a sudden change in climate? The entire nation buzzed with excitement, and I, a small and overlooked presence, burned with anxiety, a feeling only those who have endured similar suspense can truly understand. Would the proceedings, eagerly anticipated, face more delays? Would Mr. Monroe languish indefinitely in custody, shrouded by disgrace that might crush some men and could potentially break him? Would I have to endure this torment for even longer, clinging to a truth I thought I understood? But fortune was kinder than I had feared. The next morning, a telegraphic update from Santa Fe clarified one of the major points in this troubling saga, an update that would be elaborated on in a later communication published in one of our most enterprising newspapers. The letter came from a resident correspondent in New Mexico, and the editor made it clear that it was intended solely for his own eyes and not for public consumption. Nevertheless, he took the liberty of sharing it in its entirety, fully aware of the immense interest this topic held for his readers. Chapter 7. To avoid being outdone by the editor, I'm including the article here in full, as I believe its significance is clear. Santa Fe, NM, April. After arriving in Santa Fe, I asked for the whereabouts of Abner Sinclair. I was told he was at his mine, unwell. When I asked about the Placide, I learned it was approximately 15 miles away in the mountains. After I expressed my desire to go immediately, I received some advice I thought was rather unnecessary, and then I was directed to a nearby livery stable, where I was told I could find the right horse and any gear I might need. I felt I was prepared as I was, but I kept that to myself and headed to the stable. At the livery stable, I was shown a horse I immediately liked and was about to mount when I was handed a pair of leggings. "You'll need these for your journey," the stableman said. "Journey?" I echoed. 15 miles. The stable keeper, a half-breed with a notably friendly smile, shrugged slightly and remarked, "3 men just like you, keen but inexperienced, tried that same journey in the past week, and all of them turned back before they hit the divide. You'll likely turn back too, but I'll give you as good a start as if I knew you'd make it all the way." "But a woman has done it," I countered. "A nurse from the hospital went up that very road just last week." "Oh, women, they can do anything, especially nurses. But they don't set off alone. You're going alone." "Yes," I replied, somewhat grimly. "Newspaper correspondents travel alone when possible." "Oh, you're a newspaper correspondent. Why are so many men from the papers interested in that sick old man? Is it because he's wealthy?" "Don't you know?" I asked. He seemed not to. I was taken aback by his ignorance, but chose not to enlighten him. "Just follow the trail and ask for directions along the way. Every goatherd knows where the Placide mine is." That was his straightforward advice as he steered my horse toward the canyon. Just as I was about to set off, he called after me. "If you run into trouble, just let the horse take the lead. He knows more about this than you do." With a vague wave toward the northwest, he turned away, leaving me to admire the most breathtaking scenery I had encountered in all my travels. 15 miles, but those miles wound through the very heart of the mountains, reaching heights of 6,000 to 7,000 feet. Within 10 minutes, the city and its signs of life faded from view. In another 5, I felt as far from civilization as if I had journeyed 100 miles into the wilderness. As my horse settled into his work, carefully navigating the terrain, sometimes over the scorched earth, hard and dry as if baked in 1,000 furnaces, and other times through the stunted grass with its needle-like stalks that seemed never to have felt rain, I gazed at the peaks that were visible beyond the nearby hills. I found myself wondering whether the snow that capped them was whiter than snow elsewhere, or if the sky was bluer, creating a stunning effect that reminded me of intricately carved cameos on a massive, unreachable scale. The overwhelming presence of these majestic mountains, which suddenly loomed over me after leaving the streets and markets of America's oldest city, is a sensation that's hard to put into words. We crossed small streams from time to time, narrow watercourses my horse easily navigated, and encountered goatherds with their flocks, all Mexicans, who didn't seem to speak any English. They added a colorful element to the otherwise lonely journey, providing a welcome distraction. I had been informed that they would act as my guides if I felt uncertain about the trail, and in a few instances they really were quite helpful. While they may not have spoken English, their gestures made communication possible. When I mentioned the word Placide, they would nod and indicate which of the many side canyons I should follow. However, they consistently looked upward as they did so, prompting me to look up as well. After what felt like an endless journey along the winding trail, I emerged onto a ledge that offered a clear view of the opposite range. There, on the side of one of its massive peaks, I spotted a vast opening barely 200 feet from the snowline. I realized, despite how inaccessible it seemed, that I was staring at the entrance to Abner Sinclair's new mine, the Placide. The scene was surreal. The 2 mountain ranges drew so close that it seemed one could easily throw a ball from one to the other. Yet the chasm between them was immense. A wave of dizziness washed over me as I looked down and saw the endless series of switchbacks that lay ahead, each step taking me closer to the canyon's bottom. Then there would be an equally long series of switchbacks up the slope beyond, each step necessary before I could even hope to reach the camp, which appeared to be almost within shouting distance from where I stood. I had described the mine as a hole, and at first glance, that was all it seemed to be, a great, black void in the dark brown earth of the mountainside, from which a darker streak ran down into the desolate landscape far below. As I gazed longer, I noticed the ledge carved from the fragile soil, where I could now see the bright white of 2 or 3 tent tops and other signs of life. Encouraging sights for someone like me, who had to inch up that enormous mountainside. I could see why those 3 men, likely newspaper correspondents like myself, had turned back to Santa Fe after just a brief look from my current vantage point. Yet, while I understood their decision, I wasn't about to follow in their footsteps. The sight of those tents, and the thought of what one of them held, filled me with renewed determination. I loosened my grip on the reins and allowed my patient horse to move forward. Before long, I reached the divide, the point where the water flows in both directions, and started my descent. It was as zigzagged as the climb had been, but I preferred ascending. I was free from the vast emptiness that lay before me, and my imagination was less active. My thoughts were focused on the heights I aimed to reach rather than the valleys wading below. But I did not tumble. The Mexican saddle held me firmly, no matter how I tilted. Once I reached the bottom, I found that I could face the upcoming climb with a fair amount of calm. However, as I realized just how steep the next ascent would likely be, I began to wonder how I would ever manage to come back down. Ascending was possible, but the descent. Yet, as is natural, what rises must eventually fall. I put that concern aside and let my horse take the lead, encouraging him with a few blades of grass that he appeared to enjoy, despite their fragile, glass-like appearance. How we made it here, you'll have to ask this fine creature, who took on all the responsibility and did all the hard work. I gripped tightly, trying to keep my balance. Sometimes, especially when he rounded a sharp turn, I shut my eyes, even though the view was breathtaking. Eventually, even his patience seemed to wane, and he paused, trembling slightly. Just as I was about to open my eyes to the sheer drop below, he made another push forward. I felt tree branches sweep across my face, and when I looked up, I saw the ledge or platform dotted with tents that I had longed to reach from the opposite hills. At the same moment, I heard voices and spotted a tanned, bearded man with distinct Scottish features and a resolute demeanor approaching. "The doctor," I exclaimed without thinking, glancing at the small, oddly shaped tent he seemed to be guarding. "Yes, the doctor," he replied, to my surprise, in clear, fluent English. "And who might you be? Did you bring the mail and the medicines I requested?" "No," I answered, trying to look as friendly as possible in response to his stern demeanor. "I'm here on my own business. I represent the New York, and I hope you won't deny me a chance to speak with Mr. Sinclair." With a gesture I found difficult to interpret, he took hold of my horse's reins and led us a few steps toward another large tent, then signaled for me to dismount. He placed a hand on my shoulder, forcing me to meet his gaze, and said, "You've traveled all this way, if I remember right, from New York, to see Mr. Sinclair. Why?" "Because Mr. Sinclair is currently the most sought-after man in America," I replied confidently. "His wife. You know about his wife." "No, why would I know about his wife? I know his temperature and his respiration, but his wife. What about her? He doesn't know anything about her either. He's not allowed to read any letters." "But you must have read the newspapers. You would have known, before you left Santa Fe, about Mrs. Sinclair's brutal and mysterious murder back in New York. It has been the talk of 2 continents for the past 10 days. He shrugged, a gesture that could mean anything, and simply echoed my words. "Mrs. Sinclair murdered," he said, his voice low, glancing cautiously at the tent that had caught my attention. "He must not find out, man. I can't guarantee his survival if he experiences even the slightest shock in his current condition. Murdered. When did this happen?" 10 days ago, at a ball in New York. It was after Mr. Sinclair left the city. He was supposed to come back after hearing the news, but he seems to have gone straight to his destination instead. He and his wife had not been living together for the past year, so he wasn't particularly fond of her. Still, he would have felt the impact of her death, which he must have heard about during his journey. He hasn't mentioned anything in his delirium that suggests he knows. It's possible, just possible, that he didn't read the papers at all. He couldn't have been well for days before he arrived in Santa Fe. "When were you brought in to see him?" "The very night after he got here. They thought he wouldn't survive the journey to camp, but he's a man of great determination. He held on until his foot touched the platform. Then he gave in. If he was that ill, I murmured, why did he leave Santa Fe? He must have realized what it would mean to be unwell here. I don't think he did. It was his first visit to the mine. He clearly had no idea about the challenges of the road, but he wouldn't stop. He was determined to reach the camp, even after seeing it from the opposite mountain. He mentioned that he once crossed the Sierras in midwinter. But he wasn't unwell at that time. Doctor, they have no idea who murdered his wife. He didn't do it. I understand that, but in situations like these, every detail related to the event holds tremendous significance. There's one detail that only Mr. Sinclair can clarify. It can be summed up in a single word. The doctor's stern gaze flared with anger, and I fell silent. If you were a detective from the district attorney's office in New York, equipped with special authority to question him, I would still assert what I am about to say. As long as Mr. Sinclair's temperature and pulse remain at their current levels, no one else shall see him or speak to him except myself and his nurse. I turned away, a look of dismay on my face, as I gazed down the path I had just traveled. Have I toiled, sweated, and trembled for 3 grueling hours on the most arduous path imaginable only to return empty-handed? This seems quite unfair. Where can I find the manager of this mine? The doctor gestured toward a man leaning over the edge of the vast pit, from which a line of Mexicans was emerging, each carrying a sack on their back and tossing it down before what resembled a furnace made of clay. That's him, Mr. Haynes from Philadelphia. What do you need from him? I need permission to stay the night. Mr. Sinclair may be better by morning. I will not permit that, and I am in charge here regarding my patient. You couldn't remain without speaking, and conversation breeds excitement, which he simply cannot handle. A week from now, I will reconsider, assuming my patient shows signs of improvement. However, I'm not convinced he will. Let me stay for that week. I promise I won't speak any more than a corpse. Perhaps the manager will let me carry some sacks. Listen, said the doctor, guiding me further away from the tent, which he seemed to keep under constant watch. You're a clever lad, and you'll get your meal and a drink before you head back, but you must leave before sunset with this message. No reporters from either north or south will be welcome here until I display a blue flag. I say blue because that's the color of my bandana. When my patient is ready to talk about the serious stuff, I'll raise it from the top of his tent. It will be visible from the ridge, and if you want to camp out there to keep an eye out, that's fine. As for the police, that's a different story. I'll see them if they come, but they shouldn't expect to talk to my patient. Just let them know down there. It will save them the trouble of climbing up this trail for nothing. You can count on me, I replied. You can trust a New York correspondent to handle things the right way and keep the others at bay, but I doubt they'll believe me. In that case, I'll have a barricade put up 50 feet down the mountainside, he said. But what about the mail and your supplies? Oh, the pack mules can make their way up. We'll manage just fine. You certainly are in charge, I noted. Throughout this exchange, my eyes were taking in the surroundings. There wasn't much to see, but what there was held a romantic charm. Aside from the furnace and its activity, there were only a sleeping tent, a cooking tent, and the small one I had first encountered, which undoubtedly housed the sick man. This last tent was uniquely constructed, showcasing the rudimentary nature of everything at this elevation. It was simply a cloth, draped over a frame, that resembled a trapeze. The fabric barely reached the ground on either side, ending about a foot short of the flat adobe mound that served as the base for the hut or tent in New Mexico. The back of the simple tent pressed against the mountainside, while the entrance faced the valley. I felt a strong urge to peek inside, so powerful that I decided to try and satisfy my curiosity. Examining the resolute face of the man in front of me, I fancied I saw a flicker of humor beneath his professional demeanor, and I asked, somewhat glumly, if he would allow me to leave without at least a glimpse of the man I had traveled so far to see. A quick look would suffice, I assured him, as I noticed a hint of mischief in his eye. "Surely that can't do any harm. I'll gladly take it in place of supper." He smiled, though not with much enthusiasm, and I felt quite disheartened when the canvas we were focused on suddenly stirred, and a calm woman stepped out before us. She wore the simplest of clothing, yet every feature of her face and figure radiated kindness mixed with shrewdness. She was clearly waiting for the doctor, as she gestured upon seeing him, and then quickly slipped back into the tent. "Mr. Sinclair has just fallen asleep," he explained. "It's not out of discipline, and I'll have to apologize to Miss Sarah, but if you promise not to speak or make a sound, I'll let you take a peek instead of having supper." "I promise," I said. He led me to the entrance, whispered something to the nurse, then gestured for me to look inside. The scene was simple but deeply moving. The owner of palaces, a man for whom millions were nothing more than mere pocket change to someone like me, lay on a makeshift bed of evergreens, wrapped in a horse blanket with nothing but another rolled-up blanket as a pillow. At his side sat his nurse on what appeared to be a rough tree stump. Just within her reach lay a flat stone, on which a collection of bottles and essential items for the care of the patient was neatly arranged. That was all there was to it. In those few words, I have conveyed the whole story. Admittedly, this humble tent, perched more than 7,000 feet above sea level, had one benefit that even his grand house in New York could not provide. It offered an unrivaled view. Lying there, facing the valley, he only had to open his eyes to drink in the breathtaking panorama of sky and mountains that stretched before him. It was stunning, no matter the time of day, but I suspected he would have traded it in a heartbeat for a glimpse of his home. As I prepared to leave, I noticed a slight movement beneath the blanket wrapped around his chin, and I caught a glimpse of the great financier's iron-grey hair and gaunt cheeks. He was gravely ill. Even I could see that. If I had been granted the permission I desired, and had been able to ask one of the many questions hovering on my lips, he would have likely responded with nothing but delirious ramblings. There was no reaching that foggy mind now, and I was thankful to the doctor for making that clear to me. I expressed my gratitude warmly once we were a comfortable distance from the tent, and while his reply was almost kind, he didn't bother to conceal his impatience and concern for my departure. The glances he cast at the setting sun were telling, and wanting to avoid any conflict and eager to return to this place in the future, I began walking toward my horse to untie him. To my surprise, the doctor stopped me. "You can't leave tonight," he said. "Your horse has injured himself." He was right. Something was amiss with the animal's left forefoot. As the doctor lifted the blanket, the manager approached. He agreed with the doctor. There was no way I could make it down to Santa Fe on that horse that night. Did I feel a sense of excitement? Certainly. I had no desire to leave, yet I had no idea what the night had in store for me. After a moment, I was handed over to the manager, but not before the doctor gave me a final warning. "Not a word to anyone about your mission. Keep quiet about the tragedy in New York, if you care for Mr. Sinclair's life." "Not a word," I promised. Then he wandered off. Watching the sun dip below the horizon and the moon rise from a ledge that seemed to float in the air was an extraordinary experience, but I will hold back on that for now. There are more pressing matters to discuss. I was assigned a bunk at the far end of the long sleeping tent and settled in with everyone else. I expected to sleep, but as soon as I realized I could glimpse the sick tent from underneath the canvas, I became so captivated by that forbidden place that midnight arrived before I could close my eyes. Soon, all thoughts of sleep vanished, as I heard the patient begin to moan, and then talk. The unusual stillness of our lofty perch was like nothing I had experienced, allowing me to catch snippets of his words. Though they made no rational sense, they piqued my curiosity to an almost desperate level. What if he revealed something about the mystery? But his fevered mind seemed lost in memories of earlier days, and the disjointed ramblings that reached my ears were all about mining camps in the Rockies and trading horses. Perhaps it was the restless movements of my horse tugging at the end of its tether that had disturbed him. Perhaps. Yet at the sound of the second, perhaps, I found myself propped up on my elbow, straining to listen, my eyes wide as I stared at the thicket of stunted trees where the road opened up onto the platform. Something was stirring there, beyond my horse. I could hear unmistakable sounds. A rider was approaching along the trail. Sliding back into my spot, I turned toward the doctor, who lay a couple of bunks closer to the entrance. He had also awakened, and moments later stepped out of the tent. I doubted he noticed my movement, as it was quite dark where I rested, and his back was to me. The others, meanwhile, slept heavily, though they made more noise. Curiosity took hold. Everything felt fascinating at such a height. I focused my gaze on the ledge, and soon spied, illuminated by the bright glow of a full moon, the rigid, short branches of the trees giving way to a horse and rider advancing toward us. "Hello," whispered the doctor, his tone a caution in itself. "Take it easy. There's illness in this camp, and it's late for visitors." "I understand." The reply was quiet, but sincere. "I'm the magistrate of this district. I have a question to pose to the sick man on behalf of the chief of police in New York, who is a personal friend. It's related to—" "Quiet." The doctor had grabbed the magistrate's arm and turned his face away from the sick tent. Their heads leaned together, and an argument ensued. I couldn't catch a single word, but the urgency of their gestures spoke volumes. My support was with the magistrate, naturally, and I watched intently as he handed a letter to the doctor, who struggled to read it by the moonlight. Just as he was about to return it, the magistrate struck a match, lighting a lantern that hung from the horn of his saddle. The two heads came together again, but quickly pulled apart, showing every sign of disagreement. I leaned back, feeling a swell of disappointment wash over me when an unexpected sound broke through the night, drawing every eye toward the sick tent. "Water, please, someone give me water," a voice called out, calm and steady, unlike the delirium that had made it sound so unnatural before. The doctor sprang into action, rushing toward the tent. There was a spark of surprise in his movement, and the gesture he made to the magistrate as he passed ignited a flicker of hope within me, making me even more alert. It felt as though fate was smiling upon us, and I was not surprised when he soon emerged with the nurse, guiding her into the shadows of the trees for a brief conversation. If she returned alone to the tent, I would know that the doctor had chosen to assert his authority over the magistrate. But she stayed outside, and the magistrate was invited to join their discussion. When they stepped back from the trees, they moved toward the tent together. The magistrate was trailing behind, just at the entrance, and I believed he was far enough inside not to notice my movements. Seizing the moment, I quietly slipped out of my corner and crawled across the ledge to where the tent cast a shadow in the moonlight. Pressing close and resting my ear against the canvas, I listened intently. The nurse spoke in a soothing, encouraging tone. I pictured her kneeling beside the patient, whispering gently in his ear. "This is what I caught. You love diamonds. I have seen how you admire the ring on your hand. That's why I've let it stay there, even though I've worried it might slip off and roll away down the mountainside." Was I right? "Yes, yes." The words came with effort, but they were pronounced clearly enough. "It's not worth much. I keep it because—" He seemed too weak to continue. There was a pause, during which she moved a bit closer to him. "We all have our little keepsakes," she said, "but I never would have thought this stone of yours was so cheap. I keep forgetting that you own a very large and remarkable diamond, one that's mentioned in the papers from time to time. Of course, if you have a gem like that, this one must seem small and worthless to you." "Yes, this is nothing, nothing." He seemed to turn his head away. "Mr. Sinclair, I apologize, but I need to tell you something important about that large diamond of yours. You've been unable to read your letters, so you don't know that your wife has faced some issues with it. There are rumors that it's not a real stone, but merely a well-made imitation. Should I write to her that this is incorrect, and that it's exactly as you've always claimed, an unusually large diamond of the finest quality?" I listened in astonishment. Surely this was a cunning way to uncover the truth, a woman's approach. But who could deny it was possibly the most sensible course to take under the circumstances? What would his response be? Would it reveal that he was as unaware of his wife's passing as everyone believed, both those around him and those who knew him well back in New York? Or would the question convey nothing to him but a doubt, an insult to the authenticity of that magnificent stone that had brought him such pride? A murmur, if one could even call it that, escaped his parched lips and faded into an indistinct gasp. Then suddenly, sharply, he cried out, and we heard him say, "No imitation, no imitation. It was a sun, a glory. There is none other like it. It lit up the night. It blazed, it burned. I can see it now, I can see." Then the fervor faded, and his strength gave way. Another murmur and another. The vast darkness above us, almost below us, was no quieter or less impenetrable than the stillness enveloping that moonlit tent. Would he speak again? I doubted it. Would she even try to coax him? I didn't believe so either. But I didn't really know the woman. Her voice rose softly again, carrying a firm insistence beneath its gentleness, the insistence of a healthy mind striving to reach a weary one. "You don't know of any imitation, then? It was the genuine stone you gave her. You're sure of it? You'd be willing to swear it if, just say yes or no," she urged gently. Clearly, he was slipping back into unconsciousness, and she was just keeping him awake long enough to elicit the necessary word. It came slowly, each syllable dragging, but there was no mistaking the truth in his reply. "Yes." When I heard the doctor's voice, and felt a stir in the canvas against which I leaned, I took the hint and quietly returned to my quarters. I had barely settled in when that same trio I had watched earlier appeared again against the moonlight. There was some talk, with shadows mingling and separating. Then the nurse slipped back to her duties, and the two men headed toward the cluster of trees where the horse was tied. 10 minutes later, the doctor was back in his bunk. Was it just my imagination, or did I feel his hand on my shoulder before he finally lay down and settled in for some rest? I can't say for sure what happened. All I know is that I didn't give any sign, and soon enough, all movement around him stopped. I was left to bask in my victory and listen with keen interest to the strange, unintelligible sounds accompanying the horseman as he descended the cliff. I watched, mesmerized, as the sparkling light dangling from his saddle flickered and danced. It moved back and forth across the opposite mountain as he navigated its endless zigzags, finally vanishing over the ridge into the unseen canyons beyond. With the disappearance of that beacon came a wave of fatigue and sleepiness, through which I could hear fragmented words from the sick tent. They suggested the patient was back in Nevada, arguing about the price of a horse that was supposed to carry him away from an impending avalanche. The next morning, as I prepared to leave, the doctor took my hands in his and looked me straight in the eye. "You heard," he said. "How do you know?" I replied. "I can recognize a satisfied man when I see one," he remarked, releasing my hands with that same playful glint in his eyes that had encouraged me from the start. I didn't respond, but the lesson stayed with me. One more detail. When I focused on my own descent, I realized why the leggings I had were so essential. I wasn't allowed to ride. In fact, it was impossible to ride down those steep slopes. No horse could keep its balance with a rider on its back. I slid down, and so did my horse, and it was only in the valley below that we finally came together again. Chapter 8. The success of this interview sparked further efforts from the reporters who now swarmed into the southwest. Soon, details began to emerge about Mr. Sinclair's harrowing journey south after his illness had begun. The clerk at the hotel in El Morro, where the name of the famous mine owner was logged at the time of the murder, recounted a story that was much more engaging for those intrigued by the suffering and experiences of the millionaire husband of the murdered woman, rather than the plight of the unfortunate man who had been unfairly blamed for her death. When the shocking news of the terrible crime in New York reached him, Mr. Sinclair was away from the hotel on a prospecting adventure in the nearby mountains. Couriers had been dispatched to find him, and eventually one of them brought him back to town. He was discovered wandering alone on horseback in a remote area, feverish and nearly delirious. In fact, his state was such that neither the courier nor anyone else who encountered him had the heart to break the awful news from New York or even show him the papers. To their immense relief, he did not seem to show any curiosity about them. All he wanted was a ticket on the first train south, and this made it easy for them to avoid a difficult conversation. They attended to his wishes promptly, and ensured he was safely on board, taking so many precautions to keep him undisturbed that they were convinced he left El Morro oblivious not only to the details of his profound loss, but to the loss itself. This ignorance, which he seemed to carry with him to the Placide, was seen by those who knew him well as confirmation of his earlier claim, revealed during the quiet moments of his delirium, regarding the authenticity of the stone he had handed to his wife when they parted ways. With further messages streaming in, some private, others official, all emphasizing that it would take weeks before he could bear to discuss such a painful subject, the authorities in New York decided not to wait any longer for his testimony and moved forward with the inquest. As much as I am tempted to provide a detailed account of the proceedings, which were of such profound importance to me, I find it unnecessary to burden my narrative with details that would largely repeat what you already know. Mr. Monroe's close and questionable link to this crime, along with the explanations he offered, often strained, and I must admit, not always convincing, could not change the undeniable cowardice he displayed in concealing Mrs. Sinclair's gloves in my unfortunate little bag. The mystery surrounding the warning persisted, remaining just as enigmatic as ever. Efforts to determine the ownership of the stiletto were equally fruitless, despite spending half a day trying to prove that it could have ended up in Mr. Monroe's possession during one of his many recent visits to various curio shops around New York City. Mr. Monroe said he visited the curio shops in search of a casket for his diamond. This explanation was received with as much skepticism as the other justifications he had provided when the circumstances seemed to put him in a difficult spot. I had anticipated this, much like I had predicted that Mr. Harper would be absent from the proceedings and his testimony overlooked. However, my expectations didn't make the situation any less painful. Each witness who stepped down from the stand left without improving Mr. Monroe's situation even slightly or offering any fresh leads that could shift the suspicion elsewhere. With every passing moment, my resolve tightened, and I hardly recognized my own determination. I must have unsettled my uncle, for his hand remained firmly on my arm, his worried voice urging me to be cautious, not just for my sake and his, but for Mr. Monroe, whose gaze rarely left my face. Yet the verdict was not the one I had feared. While it didn't clear Mr. Monroe of suspicion, it also did not directly accuse him. I was just about to smile at him in a gesture of encouragement when I noticed my little detective, the one who had discovered the gloves in my bag at the ball, approach and place his hand on Mr. Monroe's arm. The police had taken things a step further than the coroner's jury. Mr. Monroe was arrested right before my eyes on a charge of murder.